Scott Walker is a former hostage negotiator, as well as a former counterterrorism advisor to the United Nations, and he joins me now. Scott, I was watching the sort of plaintive and agonizing entreaties by the families of the hostages today in Washington, and of course they've held numerous events in Israel as well. There was this kind of pinprick of hope, I think, that's come from the fact that 4 hostages have been released, dual citizen American Israeli mother and daughter, and then two women, Israeli women. Can you give some context for what is happening right now, to the best of your knowledge, the best as you can draw from your experience, in terms of those negotiations?
I think what we've seen so far demonstrates that the process that is in place is working. We've seen 4 hostages come out. I appreciate there's over 200 being held, but it does show you that those negotiations are working and that the lines of communication, the trust has been built between the Qataris in this case and the Palestinian and the Hamas leadership to secure the release of those hostages so far. But we're far from over with this, and there'll be lots of coordination, lots of communication going back and forth between Israel, Qatar, and Hamas.
I mean, obviously, taking hostages, the acts of Hamas in southern Israel were a war crime, and taking hostages is a violation of international law. The international law would compel an immediate and unconditional release of those hostages. They're not going to do that. Obviously, they have some value in negotiations. Do you think there's an interplay between calculations about ground incursions or escalations there and the hostage negotiations? Do you think those are on parallel tracks, or are they connected?
Well, it's very difficult to say, but I think it is fair to say that Hamas will be in no hurry to release that many hostages right now, because they serve a purpose for them in terms of being a human shield and for bargaining, etc. And it's also fair to say that any increase in military activity is potentially going to increase the risk to the hostages, not just whilst they're being held captive, but actually the most dangerous part of a negotiation is the release and recovery phase, where you logistically, physically, you have to transport the hostages to safety.
Yeah, and in terms of the details of this, I mean, you know, you have the Israeli spokesperson for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu comparing Hamas to ISIS and the Nazis, that they seek their total destruction, that they will rid the world of Hamas. At the same time, there's some kind of back channel through an intermediary with Hamas to try to get the hostages back. Is there a cutout such that no one's ever talking to each other face to face, and there's a go-between Qatari diplomats or some people like that end up being the folks that are ferrying messages back and forth?
Well, how it's done on the ground just depends on the facilities and the ability they've got to have those communications, whether or not it's in person. But we know that Hamas leadership is in Doha, in the capital of Qatar, and so those conversations will be taking place, whether or not they're over the phone or in person.
You said at the beginning of this something that I think surprised me a little bit, which is that the release of 4 hostages to you, based on your experience, showed that there was some progress being made. Do you think that process can continue?
Well, I certainly hope so, and there's no reason why it shouldn't. It just depends on how far they can get with the negotiations. And just because you're negotiating with somebody, with the hostage takers, it doesn't necessarily automatically mean that an agreement is going to be reached and hostages are going to be released. It takes time. And there's so much going on in the background and in this context that makes it probably the most challenging kind of hostage situation you could ever come across.
What are the kinds of, when you're negotiating, what are the kinds of demands of alternate prisoner releases or things of that nature that happen when you talk about a negotiation, a back and forth, just generally speaking?
It depends on the circumstances and who the hostage takers are. But in this case, they're varied. That it could be a bargaining tool, it could be to try and slow down any kind of ground incursion, prisoner exchange, and also from Hamas's perspective, to demonstrate that they're still relevant in the world. We saw before October the 7th that Israel were about to sign a deal with Saudi, for example, and actually seemed like the region was gradually moving on. And so this is another opportunity for Hamas to demonstrate to the world that they're still relevant.
All right, Scott Walker, thank you very much for sharing your expertise.